HRN listeners. As we celebrate our 15th year, we are deepening our commitment to giving voice to the next generation of food systems storytellers, and we need your help. Our internship and fellowship programs help activate new possibilities for underrepresented and underestimated young people through experiential journalism, audio engineering, and production training. Through these unique programs, HRN helps food equity stewards build essential workforce readiness skills that expand their potential and foster economic mobility. Please consider supporting these critical programs. And with a minimum donation, you can be entered to win a dinner for two at an amazing restaurant in one of 8 cities and tickets to a concert at a great venue in one of those cities. We have incredible partners across the country who have donated, as they also share our passion for helping to educate the next generation of food systems storytellers. Check out heritageradionetwork.org/15 to donate and enter to win today. That's heritageradionetwork.org/15 to donate and enter to win today. And make sure you donate before March 31st. Thank you.
This episode is brought to you by Wisconsin Cheese. Wisconsin cheesemakers produce over 600 varieties, types, and styles of cheese. That's twice as much as any other state. Learn more about Wisconsin's cheesemaking history at wisconsincheese.com.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network. We're a member-supported podcast network broadcasting over 35 weekly shows live from Bushwick, Brooklyn. This year, we're celebrating 10 years of food radio. For the past decade, we've been taking you behind the scenes of farms, restaurants, breweries, school cafeterias, and more. It's been 10 years and we're just getting started. Find us at heritageradionetwork.org.
Hello, this is Lisa Held coming to you live from Full Service Radio at the Line Hotel in Adams Morgan, Washington, D.C., and you're listening to The Farm Report, a Heritage Radio Network show about the people, processes, and policies that shape how food is produced today. My guest today is Bren Smith, a former commercial fisherman turned ocean farmer who pioneered a system called Restorative 3D ocean farming. His book, Eat Like a Fish, came out earlier this year, and he's also the founder of GreenWave, a nonprofit organization that trains other ocean farmers. Bren, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's going to be fun.
Yeah, so I wish you were here with me in studio, but where are you calling in from?
Sure, I'm calling in from right where our hatchery is, New Haven, Connecticut, and then up the road in a place called the Thimble Islands. I got my farm.
Okay, and is GreenWave also based in New Haven?
Yeah, we're in this little neighborhood of Fairhaven. It's actually one of the most low-income neighborhoods on the East Coast, and we decided to put our hatchery here in our offices because it's the land-based infrastructure for ocean farming. We can put it in places where folks need jobs, and hopefully get some social justice on the plate.
Interesting. So I definitely want to talk more about that. I have a million things I want to talk to you about in terms of your methods and the work you're doing. But I thought to frame the discussion a little bit, it would be helpful to start off by addressing the newest report that was just released by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change on the state of the oceans. So basically, it's a lot of bad news. I'm just going to read this quick snippet from the New York Times article on the report, and then I'd love to just get some of your thoughts to kind of frame this discussion. So it says, for decades, the oceans have served as a crucial buffer against global warming, soaking up roughly a quarter of the carbon dioxide that humans emit from power plants, factories, and cars, and absorbing more than 90% of the excess heat trapped on Earth by carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. Without that protection, the land would be heating much more rapidly. But the oceans themselves are becoming hotter, more acidic, and less oxygen-rich as a result. If humans keep pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere at an increasing rate, marine ecosystems already facing threats from seaborne plastic waste, unsustainable fishing practices, and other man-made stresses will be further strained. So that's super daunting, right? Mm-hmm. What was your reaction to this news about the state of the oceans?
Yeah, so I had just come back from Alaska when this came out, and was up there with Dune Lankard, who's a lifelong gill netter in the salmon fishery.
Okay.
And he asked us up here because he called me one day. He's like, "Bren, the salmon didn't come back this year." This was last year.
Right.
And so he said it's the worst season in 100 years for him. And so I went up there, and I hadn't been in Alaska in 20 years since I used to fish out of, I was in Bristol Bay, and then I was in the Bering Sea for a bunch of years. And it was stunning how things are being ravaged. So like the glaciers, so much fresh water was coming down that the salmon were actually not coming up into the bay. The water temps hit 70 degrees for a 3-week period, which is absolutely unprecedented. At the same time, wildfires, 1.5 million acres were burning and choking up Anchorage. Like, I was amazed way up north. This is what we're seeing. I'm used to Long Island Sound, where the water's heated up and all the lobsters have moved north, and all these different species coming in, all this sort of stuff. But the other piece is I feel like as a society we have this weird relationship to the ocean where we see it as a victim, not as a sort of protagonist, as a sort of one of the solutions we can leverage in the area of climate change. So the Green New Deal only mentions the ocean one time, which is stunning for me to work out in the water. Like there's more U.S. territory underwater than above. Right? And our backs are to the sea when we're thinking about climate change, and we're thinking about soil sequestration and wind and solar and all these, and reimagining our grids, and that's all absolutely essential. But we have this powerful resource that has historically played an incredibly central role in sort of controlling and limiting human climate impacts, and it's not part of our imagination. So we actually worked on the Blue New Deal in order to begin working with folks to incorporate sort of the oceans into the vision of what our set of climate solutions are. So the report, yes, it's totally dire, but let's go out to sea and see if we can really flip the script a bit.
Right. Yeah, that's so interesting too, because I've talked to so many people about the Green New Deal, and everybody's excited about how it's kind of including land-based agriculture in a way that we haven't been making those connections between food production and environment before. But everyone's talking about, oh wow, it's so great that we're talking about soil, but that's so true. I haven't heard anyone talking about it in the context of the oceans.
We talk about replanting the redwoods to soak up carbon. Well, our redwoods of the ocean are kelp forests, right?
Right.
We call them the sequoias of the sea. They're just these really incredibly powerful sort of carbon technologies, and it's and at the same time, because we can grow our seaweeds, and we talk more about this later, and use them as fertilizer, we can soak up that carbon, that nitrogen, and bring it and sequester it in the soil. As a fertilizer, as a compost. So like bridging the land and sea, I think there's huge potential. But again, it's just, I've always scratched my head over people's conception and relationship to the sea. I guess it's just that we can't see it. 40% of the U.S. population lives in coastal counties. Right? Where this is not this isolated thing. But then you go to the ocean advocates, and they'll, what they're really thinking about is conservation.
Right.
How do we set aside marine zones? And I say to them, and they're good friends of mine, I say, that's great, but you could turn the entire ocean into a marine park and it's going to die in the era of climate change unless you have engines breathing life back into the ecosystem. And I'd argue that's, us as farmers. Then you don't have a solution to climate change. And then the other sector of the ocean people, they're all obsessed with what fish to eat, which is a good discussion to have. And they're like apps of red, greens, and blues, and it's so confusing as a consumer. It's always changing. A third of the fish are mislabeled, and so they're just like, screw it, I'm going to go eat some chicken.
Right.
That's kind of where the state of our debate is.
Right, totally. Well, and I want to talk more about the solutions, but just going back to that story you were just telling about going to Alaska and seeing the impact on the fishery there, I did want to ask you a little bit about your history as a fisherman and how that informed your path. There's a lot of that in the book, and we don't have enough time for you to tell all of your stories, but can you just talk a little bit about how that path kind of informed what you're doing now?
Yeah. I mean, it's good we don't tell those stories because a bunch of them are pretty salty. Like my favorite review of the book is this guy's like, liked it, but I sure feel bad for his mom.
That's amazing.
My mom would 100% say she's not here anymore, but she'd 100% agree. But no, I mean, I was born up in Newfoundland, this little village, most eastern point in all of North America, houses painted red, greens, blues, lived next to a fisherman's co-op, just the iconic artisanal small-scale fishery.
Yeah.
And I wanted to be, my hero was to be a fisherman. I didn't want to be an astronaut. I certainly didn't want to be a lawyer. Mm-hmm. So, and the question is why did I want to become a fisherman? And it wasn't just that I was surrounded by them, but it was, they go on their own boat. They're their own bosses. Mm-hmm. They succeed and fail on their own terms, and they have this pride of feeding the country. Like they're just to me, this was the kind of job I wanted. And we used to say, we want jobs that we can write and sing songs about.
Yeah.
Like no one's writing songs about hedge fund managers, but they write hundreds about coal miners, steel workers, fishermen, and farmers, right? Because these are like soul-filling jobs. So the reason I say that is my journey from commercial fisherman, I started in Gloucester and Lynn and then was in the Bering Sea. Cod stocks crashed, and it was the height of industrialized fishing, then went to the salmon farms in northern Canada, which was really destructive, and then ended up now in my, where I am now as a restorative ocean farmer. But the common thread there was this search of how do I keep this sort of heart and soul of what is to be a fisherman. I've had to say goodbye to chasing fish, and I really miss that so much. And quite honestly, it's pretty embarrassing to grow vegetables. It was not the life plan,
right.
But underwater. But I still get to feed my community. I still get to own my own boat. I still succeed and fail on my own terms. Like that pieces of my identity. I think it's still a job that we can be proud of. A job that has meaning. So that's been the common thread. I think a lot of environmentalists think their mistake is they're like, oh, we'll just pay off coal miners. We'll transition them out and we'll give them good checks. But that's not what we want. We want these, or like we'll get them jobs doing God knows what call centers or something.
Right.
But no, we had to cherish jobs in society that we really loved, and as we think about climate solutions, we need to create an entire economy that has meaning associated with it. It's not just about getting a paycheck.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you decided to switch over to farming. I mean, it's a much longer story, but for the sake of time, we'll kind of skip forward. And then, I know you started as an oyster farmer, and you actually experienced this extreme weather event that spurred kind of the next chapter, right? Hurricane Sandy destroyed your farm.
Exactly. I mean, I was around when the cod stocks collapsed in Newfoundland. That wiped out the wild fish that I was involved in. And then here I am, a canary in the coal mine for a climate crisis that, suddenly arrived 100 years earlier than expected. Like it was supposed to be this slow lobster boil. Mm-hmm. And instead, as a oysterman, it was here and now. So yeah, my whole farm got wiped out 2 years in a row. Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Irene, 90% of my crop gone. 40% of my gear, and again, 2 years in a row. It's one thing about one time, but you get it 2 years, you realize this is the new normal. And so, that's the thing, like, climate change isn't this, it's not, for me at least, it's not about birds and bears and things. It's really about the economy. There are going to be no jobs on a dead planet.
Right.
And I lost my job because of it. But at the same time, just like all of us, I think, in this era of climate change, it's really scary and sort of horrifying. But there's also this opportunity with our backs at the wall to turn around and really innovate and get creative. I think as humans, we're kind of at our best when we're screwed. Like when things are just really dark, it's when we do all this cool stuff. So
yeah, that's so true. Like weirdly, right? It's like sometimes the biggest inspiration is like you just have to, right? It's like
yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Just a refusal to leave the water, and I think a lot of us are in that. My wife's a mental health nurse at a university, and she's just dealing with essentially a mental health crisis on campus. And it's interesting. She's trying to reimagine, okay, what is, because of like climate change and all the things that the kids talk about climate change all the time. It's stunning. And so the question is, like, as a mental health nurse, how does she think about herself and her work in this era of climate change? I feel like we're all going through that transformation. So I had to do it as an oysterman.
Right. So you turned around and you created this new system, and it's referred to as restorative ocean farming. What does it look like?
Sure. I mean, I'd say I didn't invent anything. Like what I did was I'm part of a river of 5,000 years of history. So the first restorative ocean farmers were, as far as we can tell, were indigenous communities in Washington State who created clam walls, like walls in order to cultivate clams.
Right.
So those were the first farmers. And then, an Irishman got shipwrecked in France, and he thought he made some nets to capture some birds, and instead all these mussels stuck to these nets. So he said, okay, he invented mussel farming, and now it's one of the centers of mussel farming. And so, what I did was I synthesized everything I knew, I stole, I borrowed, and tried to create a model that made sense to grow in the ocean. So what it is it's essentially just a rope scaffolding system, right? Really, really simple. If you're going to grow and do architecture under the water, you want to be a willow, not an oak, right? You don't want to fight it with pens and buildings and everything. You just want to bend with the storms and the weather and then pop back up. So just buoys and rope. There are anchors at the edge of the farm, ropes up to the surface, and then horizontal lines down below. The surface is about 8 to 10 feet.
Okay.
And from there, we grow our seaweeds vertically downwards, like kelp, and then we have scallops in lantern nets, mussels in mussel socks, and have cages with oysters, and then clams down in the bottom. And they're all different species you can grow, but just using this simple infrastructure has been the secret for me, because it's just not that expensive to build and operate.
Right. And why choose those species? Like, what is beneficial about having those particular species all together? The mussels, clams, seaweed.
Yeah. So the mistake aquaculture made originally is it grew what people wanted to eat. So we had a palette based on tuna, salmon, stuff like that. All this whole wild fishery. So everybody's like, okay, there's salmon collapsing, tuna's collapsing, let's grow those salmons and tunas. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's what makes sense to grow in the ocean. That's just trying to meet existing market demand. And so it turns out that those species that the market wants you to grow, you got to feed them an incredible amount. They poop all the time and they swim away. So there's a whole sector of us are like, okay, why don't we look at the ocean and ask, what do you want us to grow? And when you ask it that, like ask the ocean and look at it as a unique agricultural space, it says, why don't you grow things that don't swim away, you don't have to feed, and that all they do is just soak up sunlight and nutrients in the water, and your job is just to sort of cultivate that. So that's the line that we draw, right? Zero input food. And then we're working all over the country, but we only grow native species. So in every place, we'll do a landscape analysis. So for me, it really made sense to grow this particular mix of shellfish and seaweed, just because it's local and native to the ecosystem.
Right. So I love that idea that growing what makes sense for the actual environment rather than what people are used to eating, right? And I mean, that's sort of like the crux of so many of the issues we have with the food system, right? Is being like, well, everybody wants beef, so we'll figure out ways to get them that, or something that tastes like it, rather than like, what should we grow where we live and what the earth can provide us with, right? But, most people will say, well, how are you going to create a market for it? Like, how are people going to eat? You're going to get them to eat kelp, for instance. So how do you respond to that? How are you going to get people to eat seaweed?
First, just to say I'm deeply sympathetic. Like seaweed was absolutely disgusting to me. And like I said, embarrassing to grow. I used to tell people I was on the docks, I was growing underwater hemp just so I wouldn't get beat up. It's like, I totally get it. But it is the appropriate crop for, sort of this climate era because it's zero input. So a couple pieces. One is, our chefs, they're put on Earth at this particular historical moment in order to take disgusting food that's climate resilient and make it beautiful and delicious. Right? Like, if they can't do that, they should get another job, right? That's literally why they're here. And once you dive in, so my mistake originally was I worked with a lot of seafood chefs. Seafood chefs are great, but they're not great with plants. So I started working with chefs that really specialized in making plants delicious. And there's one I work with, Brooks Headley, who specializes in making vegetables unhealthy. Right. So he took the kelp, and we got some recipes in the book of barbecue kelp noodles and parsnips and breadcrumbs, right? And so you get this incredible heat of the barbecue sauce, that crunch of the breadcrumbs, that roundness of the parsnips, and the noodles just like great mouthfeel. And you no one even blinks at it. It just tastes like a delicious dish. So part of, trying to de-sushify and create sort of a new range of tastes and flavors around seaweed has been key. I think the other thing we discovered, like I discovered as I was doing this, was there's an entire lost Western culinary history of seaweeds. Like whoever's lived near the ocean, people have been eating seaweeds forever. So it used to be a bar snack in Irish and Scottish bars. There was the kelp highway all through Chile, Peru, and others, where people were cooking with seaweeds, kelp especially, all the time. There was, the Italians used it in sauces and fermented on and on and on. So part of this is rediscovering that flavor. The last thing about flavors I'd say is that everywhere we grow, what we found is it has a different flavor. So like our southern region kelp has a different mouthfeel, different coloring, and it's a very mild flavor. It doesn't taste like what you think of as seaweed. Everybody eats my seaweed and they're like, oh, this doesn't taste like seaweed. They're just surprised because it's so gentle. And with thousands of plants in the ocean, we're going to learn this new terroir, like all these different flavors, just like we know of tomatoes and arugulas and spinaches. Like we just haven't done that underwater, and this is our chance to do it. Last thing I'd say is, yes, we're going to try to change taste, but changing taste is slow and hard. You just need to recognize that. By the way, McDonald's had a seaweed burger in the 1990s called the McLean.
It doesn't exist anymore.
No, that was there for 5 years and became the official burger of the National Basketball Association.
What? That is the weirdest. I think that is definitely the weirdest fact that has ever been shared on the farm report.
Right? Just so odd, right? And, they're about to introduce a new plant burger, so, maybe we're coming full circle.
Right.
But, so there's the food piece, but one of the reasons I have real confidence is that I looked at the soy industry, which is extremely destructive, monoculture, addicted to pesticides, and we're not that because we're zero input food. But a bunch of hulking soy guys sat down in the 50s. They're like, we're never going to get Americans to eat soy. What are we going to do? And they came to the conclusion, they're like, let's put it in everything.
Right.
Let's weave it into and it is everywhere.
And you don't even know it. So you just have to get seaweed in things that you have no idea it's even in there.
And so seaweed's being used as bioplastics now in the London Marathon for water bottles. It's being used. We use it for fertilizers, feeds, coarse cosmetics, and things like that. Like the fact that we can weave it into all these existing industries and grow them, that's what gives me a lot of hope. Like it's food plus.
Right. That's really fascinating. Okay, we have to take a quick break. When we come back, more with Brent Smith, author of Eat Like a Fish.
This episode is brought to you by Wisconsin Cheese. Wisconsin has storied cheese history that begins with Swiss, German, and Italian settlers in the 1800s and continues today with nonstop innovation and award-winning artisanship. Wisconsin was the first state to establish cheese grade standards and the first to require that every cheese plant be overseen by a licensed cheesemaker. It is the only place outside of Europe where one can pursue an elite master cheesemaker certification. All of this helps Wisconsin cheese win more national and international cheese awards than any other state or country. Take, for example, Decatur Swiss Cheese Co-op, who have made cheese since the 1940s. Steve Stetler is a Wisconsin master cheesemaker who developed several new cheeses for the co-op, including a European-style Havarti, a Swiss lace cheese called Stetler Swiss, and a Colby Swiss marbled cheese. His cheeses have won awards at the Wisconsin State Fair and the World Championship Cheese Contest. To learn more about Wisconsin's award-winning cheesemakers, visit wisconsincheese.com.
Are you enjoying this podcast? Heritage Radio Network has plenty more. My name is Katie Kiefer, and I'm the host of What Doesn't Kill You here on HRN. Every week, I sit down with journalists, authors, scientists, or activists to identify and explain some of the key issues in our food system. I've done shows on food waste, labor issues, meat production, water, you name it, I cover it. You can find What Doesn't Kill You wherever you listen to podcasts and on heritageradionetwork.org.
All right, we're back. This is Lisa Held. You're listening to The Farm Report. I've been talking to Bren Smith, an ocean farmer and author of Eat Like a Fish. So, Bren, we were talking about a lot of connections between what you do and environment before the break. And, you know, you talked a lot about the fact that the things that you grow, seaweed, oysters, are zero input. Other than zero input, what are some of the other environmental benefits of farming this way?
Sure. Yeah. So, sustainability is really about lessening impact, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's sort of the zero input piece. You know, less water, less fertilizer, less feed, stuff like that, less land.
Right.
But in this era of climate change, we need a food system that actually regenerates our ecosystem. And so, like kelp, for example, soaks up 5 times more carbon than land-based plants, right? That's why the New Yorker called it the culinary equivalent of the electric car, right? So it's a powerful thing. Kelp also and oysters, mussels soak up an incredible amount of nitrogen. This is just what they naturally need to grow. And there's too much carbon, there's too much nitrogen in our waterways. Mm-hmm. And so this is just a chance to add, and I don't know if your listeners know, but nitrogen is causing the dead zones all over the globe. There are over 700 of them where they're just complete oxygen depletion because there's too much nitrogen flowing around.
Right.
They function as artificial reefs. So there's just all these, we have this structure and all these different species together, working together, and that attracts fish. And in fact, some of the best fishing in the whole area is on my farm because there's just, a ton going on. People have looked at the farms and they see them as small-scale storm surge barriers, right? Which can, if they're along our coastlines, reduce the impact of storm surges. So I don't want to oversell this. There are tons of problems and challenges we're facing, but it really does seem like one of the thousands of solutions we need out there to help mitigate climate change and rebuild ecosystems.
Yeah, it kind of sounds, it basically sounds like the ocean equivalent of what a lot of people are talking about, regenerative agriculture on land, yeah. Right? In terms of it's not enough to just not deplete soil or not destroy the earth. We have to kind of figure out ways to fix it, right? And bring things back. And so it's kind of the equivalent in the ocean. When you say there are a lot of challenges, what are some of the challenges you face in terms of growing this?
Yeah, so think of as a farmer, our soil, our equivalent soil turns over 1,000 times a day, right? It's just like a nightmare, right? And we can't augment it with fertilizer, so we can't sort of stabilize it. We just have to grow within those really dynamic conditions. And everything's underwater, so we can't see what we grow. And I don't swim, so I have no idea what's going on under there. Right?
You don't swim at all?
No. Most northern fishermen don't know how to swim.
Really?
We just say it prolongs your death. Oh. You fall in out in the Grand Banks, just calm down, say goodbye to everybody, and, let it all be.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No. So one of the challenges is some years my seaweed will be 3 feet long, other years it'll be 15 feet long. Because of all different nutrient profiles year to year. That's hugely challenging. You can think about, having to predict what markets I'm going to sell it in, as baby leaf kelp or longleaf, or I'm going to do fertilizer or things like that. So that's why sensors, I'm not a techie, but sensors have been absolute key on the farms. We've started to embed sensor packets in 4 different states. And that gets really interesting because in 4 states this year, our farmers got paid to harvest data. So they got paid $25,000 to harvest the data, and that got a tech company got it all. And so the farmers own their own data, but the synthesized data went up to the tech company. So suddenly, can you have a farm that's, growing food, but then also harvesting data and harvesting things like carbon and ecosystem services. So you have multiple forms of income on a farm. I mean, that's so like there's a challenge that we can't see what we grow and our soil turns over, but then also there's a real opportunity, I think, to create sort of harvestable income streams through data. Another challenge is, and I think a lot of everybody in food has this challenge, which is one thing to grow things, things to sell things, but infrastructure and food logistics is so complicated. Like my model works when you're out in the water. As soon as you hit the land, I face everything that other small scale farmers face. Right,
like
buildings are expensive.
Yeah.
Supply chain and infrastructure, those processing plants and things. The margins are really low. And I think people don't understand that. They're like pennies. On each product. So that's a huge challenge. The other challenge is staying ahead of the climate curve. So water temps and stuff are just changing so fast. I'm at the southern region of where kelp can grow, my type of kelp, sugar kelp. In 10 years, I'm going to have to be growing something else. So our R&D needs to be moving quickly and ahead of the pace of climate change so that I'm prepared to grow one of these other thousands of crops, when the conditions really, really change. The other thing, and I go all day about problems, I like problems, but I think the other challenge is there's a lot of uses for this, for different types of seaweed, but it's less, the price point's really off from farming. So wild harvest is a lot cheaper to do than farming. So, and the existing uses of the market are so used to wild harvest. And, again, I've got great friends that wild harvest, and I don't criticize them at all. We need to, start farming, but it's just more expensive. So making sure that price point is matched is just challenging.
Yeah. Well, and, kind of speaking to, the costs, and I know there are a lot of challenges related to costs, but one thing that struck me is it seems like the startup costs for starting a farm like this are actually quite low. And I mean, I talk to a lot of young or beginning farmers who are trying to make it, farming on land, and the cost of land is just incredibly prohibitive. Yeah. And I mean, to make it as a beginning farmer on land is really, really hard if you're trying to do like a small, diversified farm. What does it cost for a beginning farmer to start a farm like this?
Totally. So it's funny, we have a lot of young land-based farmers coming to us because exactly that. It's just so expensive on land. And we basically, if you have a lease, and a lease is, well, at least my area, it's about $50 an acre per year, right? So really cheap for those water rights.
Right.
And so if you have 20 acres, a boat, and you have depending on the place, $20,000 to say $50,000. It just depends on the region. Out here, it's $20,000. You can be up and growing, and your first year. And the reason is because we don't have to water, we don't have to feed, we don't have to fertilize. Don't have much gravity, so we don't need a lot of infrastructure. Just ropes and buoys. It's really, really pretty cheap. But I think of it as sort of the nail salon model of the sea. Low capital costs, minimal skill requirements, and you got to be willing to be out there in the winter.
Yeah.
And that's what I've had to learn. Kind of like things that I love and are pretty straightforward from the fishermen, land-based farmers, and others that come. It's just they might be great at growing, but boating skills and sort of some of the extremity of the weather they're not used to.
Yeah, and how long are most of those leases? Like, is there enough stability in like an ocean lease for a farmer to know that they can lease that space and it's not going to be taken away from them, and after a year after they get their equipment or?
Totally. It's a really, and a really important question. It depends region or region. And you either lease from the town, in my area, the town, the state, or the federal government based on how far out it is. So the first little bit, it's town leases, and then it moves to state. And we sign leases either 5 to 10 years, and then options to renew. And so it's good. So the community is a lever of sort of democratic control that if we are screwing up, they can revoke the lease after 5 years and then, or 10, but then we have the first right of renewal. And, that's out here in New England. California is a whole nother challenge because they actually haven't given, a new lease out in about 19 years, I think, for shellfishing or anything. New York is interesting. It's actually not legal to grow kelp or seaweeds in New York State. We have 3 farms right now that integrated shellfish and seaweed farms, but the farmers aren't allowed to sell their seaweed. We're hoping to launch a campaign this year called Legalize the Other Weed in New York because
That's a good name.
we can grow it. And but
why is it illegal? That's so strange.
Well, it's not legal. Like, it's never been done or legalized in New York. So so we need to pass. I mean, we wrote the legislation here in Connecticut. We're working in California. There's been great work in Alaska. So we need to do that state to state as we move through.
It's not illegal. It's just that no one has ever really
Exactly.
tried to sell it. So there's
Yeah, and no one tried to farm it and sell it.
Mm-hmm.
But you think of permitting. So I think it's going to look very different in different regions. So I think New England has a long tradition of shellfish farming and leases and a lot of infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And so the move into a polyculture model, which we've been doing, has made a lot of sense. I think somewhere like California, where we're working in San Diego and Humboldt County, we have sort of leases and moving forward there, but is much more like a land trust model where we take 2,000 acres, say, we call it a climate zone, and we do a mix. So we have our farmers reforesting, so just planting, right, not the harvest. Okay. So they have carbon sinks. We have all these pre-permitted plots where people can farm, and then if they leave, other farmers can come in. So it's just like a permitted spot. And then you have artisanal fisheries, and then you have just this organized zone of to allow for reforestation farming and fisheries. But it's owned by an intermediary like a land trust, right? So it's not privatized. It's all protected. It's just people have pre-thought the use of it. So those sea trusts, I think we're going to begin seeing in different areas. And that might, for those of you listeners that really know land-based farming, then it becomes kind of like an agroforestry model where so you have tons of people reforesting like 91% of kelp forests are gone in Northern California. It's just brutal because of urchins and all sorts of stuff. Well, if we create an army of folks reforesting and then inside those forests doing partial harvesting to sell, but they're getting paid to both forest and to run their own, small business, small farm in there, I think we get into a much more climate resilient model.
Right. Well, and you mentioned earlier that you're on the southern, like where you are is the southern end of where you can grow kelp, I guess, on the East Coast. Can you talk a little bit about like where, I feel like there's so much potential with kelp, but where can it be grown? Like I feel like it's limited where it can be grown, right?
Yeah. Well, there are 250 types of kelp, and I grow a sugar kelp, which is a northern species. And so we've got folks we work with in Mexico that grow in Chile and Iceland and all different places. So it depends on the species. Then there are species, other things like Asparagopsis, is the red seaweed that we use is really good for animal feed because it significantly reduces methane output by 58% if you feed cattle at 2% diet. It's just pretty stunning. But that's a southern climate species like Gulf of Mexico. Okay. No one's really farming it down there at this point. So again, it's part of that landscape analysis of looking about what makes sense to grow where.
Right.
I think the big challenge is, I really know how to grow here in New England, like in Long Sound. Like I know my patch of water. Every patch of water is going to be different, and every species mix is going to be different.
Right.
So, and can you grow it enough in a certain area to make a profitable farm? That's always the question. So when we work with farmers, we've got a waiting list, by the way, of 4,000 farmers.
To do the training?
Yeah, to do our green. So GreenWave, has a training program, and it's pretty intensive to help people get started. But we've got a waiting list of 4,000 people, and
that's incredible.
Yeah, it's kind of heartbreaking because there's just no way we can meet this demand. But we encourage people to start just with 2 lines, right? Just to grow. So to start with kelp because it's pretty easy, and just put in the gear and do what permaculture does, right? Permaculture, you're supposed to watch your land for a year, right? See where the rain runs and the sunlight and all this sort of stuff. Well, same for ocean farming. So put in a couple lines and then just watch your currents, your growth rates, how your gear is moving. And then from there, we're able to, estimate whether you can create a successful farm based on the yields that you're getting. So, a lot of people come in and they want to just jump in and plant 25 acres, 50 acres right away. And we really encourage people, start very small, build your business model after those tests. And then, because it might not be the right patch of water, right? But so you just got to find one with the right mix, which, again, there's a lot of nutrients in the water, so it's not that challenging, but we don't want people to, go slow approaches. Makes sense as a farmer.
Right. Yeah. So we started with kind of this dire situation when I just was like, hey, let's start with the climate report that is really depressing. And but we've been talking about some really incredible solutions, and the fact that you have, and there's a lot of challenges also that we talked about, but do you feel like the fact that you have 4,000 people waiting for that training, does it make you hopeful? Are you hopeful that this kind of ocean farming will really take off?
Yeah, I think, our climate winds are at our back, right? There's a nutrient deficiency on land. Whether it's, we're running out of land as a resource. We have rising seas. There are all these issues. Our food system's going to be pushed out to sea in part, and our wild fisheries just can't handle it. That's clear from the UN reports.
Right.
So ocean farming is going to be a core piece of the puzzle. I'd like it to be restorative ocean farming, of course, is our model, but we're going to be getting more food from the sea no matter what. So that gives me incredible hope. The big question for me is, will we build it the right way? What's exciting for me in this space is we got a blank slate, and we get to kind of take everything that's been learned and all the mistakes on land, everything that's been learned and made in industrial aquaculture, and just kind of do agriculture right this time, right? Let's not privatize our seed. Let's make sure beginning farmers have access to land. Let's make sure we weave social justice into the DNA of this and make sure the folks that have been left behind by the Industrial Revolution are in the front of the line and get the benefits. Let's make sure that farmers own more of that whole value chain, so they're good middle class jobs as opposed to part-time jobs like they are now on land. That's exciting. But the sharks are going to come. I've got a part in the book called Swimming with Sharks, where we already have some of the biggest companies in the world coming and leasing property, coming out and essentially trying to take over the industry.
Right.
And that really scares me. If how are we going to defend our land and what we think of as the most exciting part of this is build a truly regenerative economy based on this opportunity and so our idea is, Green Wave Reefs is what we build, where we have 25 to 50 small-scale farms in an area, a hatchery and a processing plant in a low-income neighborhood, and then rings of entrepreneurs doing value-added products, and then you replicate that reef. And I'm hoping that distributed production and sort of wiring these farms and knowledge networks, having farmers work closely and sharing knowledge, will give us a competitive advantage against the huge monoculture companies that are going to come into our space, because they will come. But I think we know we've learned a lot, and hopefully the food movement will defend our rights and help us get there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope that you got your song about an ocean farmer maybe at some point, right?
Yeah, so one of your listeners got to write it.
Maybe somebody will write you a song.
I definitely need a bar song. It's too boring in my bars. We get nothing to sing about except for old fishermen.
It could help inspire some more ocean farmers.
Yeah. Exactly.
Thank you, Brent, so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, honored to be on. Thanks so much.
Thank you all so much for listening to the Farm Report on Heritage Radio Network. If you enjoyed the conversation, please subscribe to the podcast, rate it, and share it. I'll see you next week.
This program is powered by Simplecast.
Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. For our freshest content, subscribe to our newsletter. Enter your email at the bottom of our website, heritageradionetwork.org. Connect with us on Instagram and Twitter at heritage_radio. You can also find us at facebook.com/Heritage Radio Network. Heritage Radio Network is a nonprofit organization driving conversations to make the world a better, fairer, more delicious place. And we couldn't do it without support from listeners like you. Want to be a part of the food world's most innovative community? Subscribe to the shows you like, tell your friends, and please join the HRN family by becoming a member. Just click on the beating heart at the top right of our homepage. Thanks for listening.